here a sort of a 10-minute video, and I'm going to see if I can play it and make the technology work. Okay.
Maui, can you share us the link? So
yes.
Everybody, I gonna recommend everybody in the session to see the link, please, because there is a delay. We're always experience this delay with the Zoom. So just please watch in the chat. Professor Maui is sharing us the link so you can see the video and understand and see it better. I'm sorry, and see it better. I just as a quick introduction to the topic to both ends, I would like to mention that one of the main goals of the convention is the inventorying. And inventorying is about archives and libraries and everything. So I think in that sense, it's very important that we understand what's the purpose of your research. So thank you very much again. I'm sorry for not delivering a precise introduction. We were just leaving one session, but thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And yeah, we'll see if the video works, and then afterwards we can talk a little bit more about how it. Okay, let's see if I can make this work. Screen or share. I'll go like.
Yeah, the audio is not running.
Okay.
So just leave it running, and please do watch the link. It's a 10-minute video, and after the video ends, we'll get back to the talk for questions.
The video is not.
Gustavo, we can't see the video.
Video is not sharing. Please share the link. I will put the video on screen.
There is the link. The link is in the Professor Maui put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm watching it at the moment and it works fine.
Yeah.
Thanks. In the link.
Yeah.
So is there no audio as well?
No, it's better to have it without the audio so people can see the link, because if not, it's going to make a mess.
The communities that I've worked for, basically I saw the archive radically fail them. Indigenous communities didn't have any control over their cultural heritage, their histories, their family photographs. It was all held within institutions, and not only did communities not have control over that, they didn't have access to it. I mean, so you've got these histories of extraction and of deliberate theft, but you have a really real, tangible, practical problem for communities in relationship to how do they get control of their cultural material back.
One of the challenges that's emerged in this context is really how you think about intellectual property and what does it mean to own cultural heritage, what does it mean to own traditional knowledge, if that sort of thing is even possible.
The law doesn't care about the content. That's part of the challenge, that's why it doesn't work very well. It can only see things through a property lens.
There's a sort of a vagary in the system where, because traditional knowledge has accumulated over time, it's not subject to the rules which allow an intellectual property to be granted over it. But as other researchers come in and start to write about those communities and write about their knowledges, then they can assert copyright over that material. And so you end up in a situation where outsiders, researchers, institutions hold the copyright over communities' knowledge.
At a legal end, you can't retroactively go and fix some of these problems, right? They're persistent and they're in many ways permanent over decades. What else could you do that could mark that material differently, that could bring cultural authority back into the record, and that could then allow communities to have different kinds of relationships around how that material could be used into the future?
Other Native groups started talking about Indigenous knowledge labels, and I said that's the way to go. That's the way it should have been in the very beginning.
The traditional knowledge labels, or the TK labels, are really digital tags that can sit alongside the digital assets or the knowledge. So as that knowledge is circulating around the world, those tags can be sitting there alongside to guide what appropriate behavior looks like.
Native tribes are starting to utilize it because it gives us more control over our songs, over our cultural material.
The Passamaquoddy wax cylinder recordings were made in Calais, Maine in March 1890.
These are songs from our ancestors that haven't been heard for 120, 130 years.
As a matter of fact, the first time I actually listened to the wax cylinders, it really, I was very, very emotional.
These songs were sitting in an archive waiting for us, and the right moment that they came was the right moment that we needed them.
The Library of Congress contacted us about the possibility of using the labels for the Passamaquoddy wax cylinder recordings. The record as it existed prior to doing this work was an impoverished one. We know kind of nothing. And then once you engage with the communities about that, it just opens up.
This is where the excitement begins. This is where we start getting excited.
We'd play maybe a sentence at a time, and then a word at a time.
I could feel the spirit, you know, through these songs, and I just felt a real deep connection.
The process of the labeling ran kind of in a parallel way. It was like both uncovering what the sound on the recordings was and then thinking about where can cultural authority from the Passamaquoddy rest with these recordings and how can that be kind of woven back in.
Yoneha, 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 yoneha.
It helps us to take possession of that song back instead of somebody interpreting what that song is and what it means.
What now exists in the Library of Congress is an updated record with an enormous amount of traditional knowledge that Passamaquoddy have shared, as well as 3 labels that are really visible and as close to the content as possible. So that's kind of the public-facing part of the record now. But what sits behind that is the digital infrastructure itself. Digital infrastructures are not neutral. Digital infrastructures carry the bias of all the other systematic frameworks around them. And when we start adding Indigenous names and Indigenous protocols and Indigenous rules and Indigenous permissions, we find out there's not a field for that. So we had to create a new field.
If you start to create the infrastructure that enables this sort of provenance information to be done, then you start to encourage and support researchers that want to do the right thing to do the right thing. In the context of genetic resources, you're in a very similar situation.
How do we create a set of labels that can deal with the biocultural information that is coming out of Indigenous community contexts?
In most places around the world, when you're thinking about genetic resources, what gives Indigenous communities rights in relation to them is the associated traditional knowledge. In terms of equity and in terms of benefit sharing, those things become increasingly hard to do if the right sort of provenance information isn't collected at the point where the projects are done.
That means that the second and third user, or the fourth and fifth users, have no information about where this data has come from.
What the label does is it creates a really clear pathway for that next user back to the source community so that they can then talk about what appropriate use, what appropriate benefit sharing looks like. When I'm thinking about how the application of the labels works within my community, Whakatohia, we've engaged in it in part because we've got interests in the marine space. We know there's a difference between the mussels which we catch and grow locally and the ones that we bring in from other places and grow on there. We've joined up with a research group and they're going to gene sequence not only the mussels that are on our farm, but the ones that are collected in recreational sites all along the coast. When the gene sequence for the mussel is generated, we'll attach the biocultural labels to that, so then that data is subject to the conditions we put in place through the use of the BC labels.
What's really exciting about the biocultural labels is that they start to allow us to scale this work in a different kind of way.
When you're dealing with collections of biospecimens that number in the thousands and tens of thousands, you know, these collections have taken a long time to put together and it will take a long time to correct this sort of missing provenance information. But at least we're creating space for that to happen.
As we've kind of moved the project into different kinds of spaces, we've understood that researchers need particular tools and institutions need particular tools. And the notices are a system that allow institutions to mark records as well as to kind of mark their intent to engage around this work.
The work of the researcher and institution is to say there are Indigenous interests here. And we're making sure that those interests are transparent to other users. And that's where the use of the labels and the ability of the communities themselves to say these are the right labels for this context and these are what they mean to us.
One of the most powerful things that we've experienced as a community is gifts coming back from our ancestors.
If we think about the traditional knowledge that's being shared as a gift and what the essence of that is and how that's maintained, and then the sorts of protocols that can be used to ensure that it's used in the right sort of way, That's what we see the labels sort of helping us do.
We are still here. It's amazing.
Thank you, Kaloyan, for your support and speechless. Let's give a round of applause to the great work you've done. Thank you very much for that video, Dr. Janette. I don't know if you've been praised enough, but really amazing, really, really. Congratulations. So I leave the floor open for questions, please. Well, I have the first one, no problem. How can we join and enhance this effort within our archives, local archives, national archives, and so on?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely an element of visibility so that people see that this sort of work is important. The primary places where it's been applied has been in North America, partly because that's where the communities that have been working alongside Dr. Anderson, Dr. Kristen in the past were based in those areas. They've Kim Kristen, one of the other co-founders, has been involved with putting together Merkutu, which is a content management system. So the place where communities can store material themselves. And then when they wanted to try and work out how they could, I guess, tag the material, that sometimes the material comes back to them, but sometimes it also sits within archives. And so our community at the moment, Whakatohea, are working with the National Sound and Film Archive to both get copies, or we call it digital repatriation of material, into our own sort of digital library, but then be able to put the tags on the material that stays in the archives so that other people that are accessing, you know, our songs, our recordings, will know what our protocols are. And so we're just in the middle of doing that at the moment. And yesterday we had a workshop with our advisory group that was around customizing the labels. We spoke to the National Archive of Mexico last week, and so they were interested in that. So I think the first stage is awareness. The second stage is we have a cultural institutions working group, and so there's about 70 different institutions around the world that have been using the labels, or looking at how to use the labels, so they can learn from the experience of people that have already put them in place within their own institutional infrastructure as well.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Ananya in the chat and from Dr. Janet Blake. I will give the opportunity to answer to Ananya. Okay. How does this relate to Creative Commons licensing for digital content?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting thing. So when we talked about the fact that most communities don't have a copyright over their traditional knowledge because of the length of time that it's come about. Now, you can only put a Creative Commons license on if you have the copyright in the first place. And so what usually happens in that context is the researchers, the project is collecting the information, and they're making it available to everyone to use through a Creative Commons license, but at the same time, they've effectively claimed the copyright for themselves. And so you've got two things. One is the claiming, and then the second one is the saying, yes, it's all right for anyone else to just kind of do whatever they like with it. So what we're trying to do is with the labels, and the labels can sit alongside copyright. So they're not a legal mechanism. So they can sit beside copyright, which might sit in different places, but it really just says, he is the primary cultural authority for this material. And you should go and, if you want to do things with it, you should go and talk to them. So and it gives a way of connecting back to that community. That's what we're trying to put in place.
Thank you very much. I will give now the floor to Dr. Janette Blake. Just a brief introduction, Professor Maui. Dr. Janette is one of the tailors of the convention, a very well-known lawyer and knowledgeable people in the field of cultural heritage. Thank you. Please, Professor.
Well, I would just ignore all that, actually. But thank you very much, Gustavo, for that introduction. And I'm so delighted that I'm not the only Dr. Janette here today, although we spell ourselves differently, but yours is a much nicer spelling, by the way. So I was actually asked, to join this, not really as a kind of discussant. So that's really what I want to do, Gustavo, right now. Is that okay? I won't take too much time. But first of all, I really want to thank you so much for sharing with us, your wonderful video, but much more important, that really wonderful work you're doing. And I think that it raises so many important ideas that we need to develop and work on together. We had a meeting on IP and the 2003 convention. Was it 2 days ago? It feels like about 2 months ago now. But one of the things that we were talking about in that meeting was the importance of taking a broad cultural approach to safeguarding this heritage, one in which IP rules may play a part, but recognizing their limitations, as you mentioned. And I think also it's wonderful the way that, in a sense, you're going ahead of the law here by saying, look, this is a way to do things. This is a sort of soft law approach almost. But by putting that in practice by the president, over time, I'm sure you will also guide the development of future legislation. And that would be my hope. And I think that it's important to get beyond a narrow focus on intellectual property, which has its place, but as you've recognized, is based on principles which are so far removed from the principles that we're talking about in this field. And I think the cultural heritage law, per se, maybe has a lot to offer. But I think also that, speaking as a lawyer, one thing that we really have to grapple with is that at the moment we have two domains. We have a private domain and a public domain. And, neither works for this range of knowledge. So in a way, what we really need to be thinking about is how do we create that new space, that third domain, that's neither the private domain of monopoly rights of intellectual property, nor the public domain where you just put everything out there and hope for the best. It's something else. And in a way, I think that the 2003 convention and its development to some degree is moving us in that direction, because it does speak about, for example, documentation institutions, and it speaks about the importance both of ensuring access and, first and foremost, the access of the bearer communities to their heritage, but respecting customary rules of access too. And on top of that, we now have a series of ethical principles which very much underpin that approach. So what I'm trying to say here is I hope that, work such as yours, which, as I say, is just really wonderful. I love it. Alongside what is going on in this convention, a critical mass here can build up and develop something, I think, very exciting in the future, even in the law. But I mean, isn't it sad that your country, like my home country, are not parties to this convention? So that's got to be another a place to fight, right? Is to, you know, is to overcome that resistance in the Anglo world, as it were, in the states that see themselves part of that Anglo alliance. And it's, you know, but as I said, really, I think it speaks to what we are trying to do. And I think work like yours is really contributing amazingly to hopefully achieving that change in the future. We know the law works in a very slow timetable, but maybe we can pour a bit of new wine into those old bottles with help of projects like yourself. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Janet, for that. I think it's very important. I don't know how to encourage countries to get involved in the convention, but it's Dr. Janet, there is a task for you. But well, so any comments, Professor, you want to address to the comment by Dr. Janet?
Yeah, so yeah, I just say, so my background has been a bit more in ethics. And so, you know, we talk about soft law, that's often that space. And one of the things that we have been, you know, working around, it was an interesting little conversation as we were starting the discussions around Indigenous data sovereignty. And really that was a discussion about where do Indigenous people's rights and interests sit in relation to data in all sorts of forms, as we could see that it was being shifted either through open science into that public sphere, or it was being claimed by groups in a sort of a private sphere. And there was no space for the community's interest in relation to that material to come through. And that's where that sort of focus on Indigenous data sovereignty arose. But when we were we had a discussion with some cybersecurity researchers actually. And, you know, after a little bit, he's going, oh, look, you know, I get you're all on about rights and things, but, you know, when we're working, we deal with standards and funds. That's how we control stuff in sort of in a technical manner. And so that really pushed us into thinking about just how you get something in place that works. And so alongside, I think the work which Jane and James have done in terms of creating the labels, and that's been created directly with communities over about 10 years, almost sets up a little bit of a standard. Each of the labels is a sort of something that reflects particular types of protocols. And even though every community has their own unique ones, they're sort of grouped into those areas. And so we can start to use them with multiple institutions or across, you know, different jurisdictions. And the kind of our challenge now, because we know that that sort of standard is grounded in Indigenous sort of values, is how do we shift it into a platform that can then be used at scale. And that's the stage we're at now with the local context hub, and creating something which institutions as well as communities can now become a part of. And so essentially, as institutions start thinking about, I guess, decolonization activities or diversity, you know, sort of diversity initiatives, they can start thinking about how they say, look, you know, we're open to collaborate. We haven't got, you know, the attribution of the number of these items is incomplete, and sort of invite communities to come and work with them. And so the ones that will do it are only the ones that have that capacity or that ability to over time. But I think it's something that builds. So the library, the example which was shown with the Passamaquoddy in the video, that was with the Library of Congress. Now there's about another 6 or 7 communities that are working with them, because the institution had to change their digital infrastructure around. And so while it was working with one community, it meant that they could put them in place for any other community, and they could put it in place on any item within the Library of Congress. So we sort of try and change what's possible in the infrastructure, and then allow the relationship to develop between the institutions and communities as it needs to.
Sorry. Great. Thank you. There's a quick question by Dr. Janette on how you develop the symbols for the labels, given the sensitive symbols, how sensitive symbols are in this matter.
Yeah. So the labels are, that work was primarily done by Jane Anderson as she was working with communities. One of the challenges in doing that was to not make them too specific to a community and to their sort of customs, given it had to be available for everything. So, if it looked too Maori, then our Aboriginal colleagues might not want to use it. If it looked too Aboriginal, then sort of colleagues from other places might not want to use it. So it was, I guess, try to reflect the intent, but in a very generic kind of way. So, and I think that's, it's an important point, because you're trying to get the right balance between doing something that can be applied in different jurisdictions, whether those are tribal jurisdictions or kind of institutional and country ones, but you want it to not to be local. And so it's called local context. And so while the icon itself is stable, it remains the same, the text that's associated with it is customized by each community. So the attribution label for my community is different to the attribution label for Janet's community, or one from Australia, Hiko, other places. And so the only way that we can do that is to create a unique identifier for each project. So as the projects are put together in the hub that kind of would relate a notice or then labels to a particular item or a particular set collection of items, there's a unique identifier with them. So the intention is that an institution could put a notice on. They can notify the community. If the community is already on the hub, it will go directly to them. If they know who it is, they can give us a contact details, and we can invite the community to come on. And as they create labels and decide which ones they want to apply to that project, they can automatically replace it. So we're trying to create a machine readable component of the system so that communities can work with institutions right around the world as required. And also they have the ability to update their labels as well. And the most recent version will always be available to those in those databases and with those institutions.
Thank you, Professor. Very clear. And it's a very interesting thing, because I believe that you're working first of all with bias, because people has this idea that the culture belongs, and so they belong, and culture belongs to them. And so this is a very interesting process on how we're building as a whole this concept of archives, who's doing them, who's running the libraries and everything. And so in that sense, I think this really gives communities back control over their IP on the different traditional cultural expressions and traditional knowledge. We call it intangible cultural heritage. That's our field, but it's the same, and I think we will find very much in common, and we will be happy to endorse and help with your job. So this is my last year as a member of the steering committee, but I will propose a working group for your research on traditional labeling, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions labeling, because I believe it should be known by all the accredited NGOs and should be promoted for the benefit of communities and enhancement. Is there someone else who would like to take the floor? Please raise your hand or in the chat. Laurier?
Yes.
Oh.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank both speakers and also Janette for those very good presentations and comments. You know, it made me think. I'm a historian and an anthropologist, and I've done some collecting, and I'm actually a Métis myself from Western Canada. But I live in Quebec, you know, so I've sometimes, you know, thought about these things. And for example, I kind of wanted to know what you thought about, you know, collecting. And I know, you know, we've had a very critical position on that, and for, you know, for good reason. You know, recently I've been very critical myself, I have to say, about collecting, and, you know, I have stopped doing it myself. You know, I've sort of thought about it more recently because there's been a couple of cases where, for example, you know, Maliseet music and singing in Canada, in Eastern Canada, you know, has the recordings of some of the anthropologists that were done in the late 19th century have been used to, you know, by Maliseet people to, you know, become more familiar with their language, and also to use it to make modern music. And one of the, you know, most known most known musical composers in Canada right now is Maliseet, and he has been inspired by these recordings, you know. And maybe just one other example is, you know, the Jesuits who did dictionaries of Huron language, you know, to convert the Huron, right? You know, so that it was a tool to convert the Huron to Christianity and to colonize them. Are now being used by the Huron people to relearn their language. So it's sort of an interesting kind of, you know, turnaround of history, where these recordings are now being used by Aboriginal peoples to revitalize and to reappropriate their language, you know. And so, you know, I find this very interesting, and so I kind of wanted to have your thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of things. One is, you know, in the video, there's a great example, at least in terms of, you know, how Donald talked about the that material coming back to the community when they needed it. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a lot of that. So I think the issue in part is really about the nature of the relationship and the power relationship between the places where the collections are and the communities themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think the labels in and of themselves isn't really sort of an end goal. It's often a step towards then developing a different sort of relationship. And so, you know, the label being in place, then you can think about, and this is what we're doing in Whakatohia, how can we use that material ourselves for our own purposes, just like, you know, you've described with Maliseet. And then you have a different, you have two different relationships that start to emerge. One is the one with the institution and the sort of lens that is placed on the material which they're holding. So it's being collected. It's often had a very often functional lens or sort of Western lenses, sort of understanding about it. You can get into a different sort of co-curation of that material and how it then gets presented out to the public. And then alongside that, the community themselves, because they're now you know, as you said, they were rediscovering some of these things, can think about how it supports them with language revitalization or other sorts of cultural revitalization as well.
Thank you for that, Professor.
Yeah. That's absolutely, yeah, it's a good point. Good point. And with repatriation now, you know, I think many Indigenous populations are realizing that, you know, these materials are in the museum and that they can have access to them, whereas before, you know, most of them didn't even know that they were in the museums or didn't know where to find them, you know.
Just was just a remark, no, L'Oreal?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so thank you. We had, I'm sorry, I saw the hand, Diana.
Diana, I think. Diana
yes,
had a question.
Please.
Very much. Greetings to you all. My name is Diana. I'm the director of Embodying Reconciliation, Cuerpos para la Reconciliación, an NGO that works in Colombia, and we are currently in the process to be recommended, to be accredited. And we work to identify, protect, and promote ICH, but also corporalities, interculturality, and memory, because we're using ICH also as a tool for skills building and community building. Last year, we connect with some colleagues of the local context. We spoke with Jane Anderson, because we are currently developing a virtual museum where we want to promote and make visible the local heritage of the different actors we are working with in Colombia, and also make visible their peace actions in a very responsible, creative way. So we didn't really know, okay, which is the framework that really can that makes sense for the type of work we are doing. So in this sense, I would like also to introduce you to my colleague Jorge from Ecuador, which is our lawyer, and he can explain a bit more about how we are applying these TK labels in our museum. Jorge?
Thank you so much, and everybody, so nice to meet you. Glad to get to know you and to have this brief exchange. And indeed, we've been working at embodying reconciliation, not only to recover tangible or intangible expressions, but also to try to discover their potential for reconciling and for healing personal trauma through collective expressions and through collective practices. And the interesting thing for this project is that since we are working and we were working with new technologies, for example, with motion capture or new human movement recognition technologies for the sake of working with traditional dances, there are a lot of discussions, even legal discussions, that are still yet to be solved in that sense of like what kind of knowledge is it that we are digitizing when we have 3D renderings or digital avatars performing any particular movement. And so in that sense, since we wanted to build a more horizontal and honest relationship with communities, that is why we wanted to have these tools by local context. And I think I'm going to close up saying that this is a work that it's going to happen in different phases. And at the beginning, at this very first phase, we decided to use these general labels, for example, stating that we are open for communities to receive the information of how they want for those items to be described or curated. But I guess there will be a second, more specific or more detailed phase where particular elements could carry particular TK labels. That is all that I had on my part, and so nice to meet you again.
This is wonderful. You're having already people working with the system. And gracias, Jorge. Gracias, Diana. Bienvenidos. And so they're welcome now. They're new NGOs, recently going to be accredited. So we're a growing family, and we're eager to support and promote this kind of efforts. So please see the ICH NGO Forum as your ally, and someone you can rely whenever you want to reach. We have a presence in more than 50 countries with over 190 organizations all around the world working in this topic. So please, we have them. I know Matti is very interested in making you a question because he's eager to talk about, no, the Sami, come on, the Sami people.
We did a talk to the Sami archives earlier in the year.
That's it. We have a talk. On the symposium, we had this chat about intellectual property. I addressed the issue of Walt Disney and Pixar with the films they're doing and how they're taking the intangible cultural heritage and then profiting and licensing after they take it. And so it's very interesting because what happened in my country is they came, the Disney Corporation, and the authorities will say like, yeah, sure, take it, it's yours. You can profit from it. And so they did it. And then we had this issue because they used one element of a specific handcraft and they license it to Mattel. And so Mattel is doing the actual handcraft in plastic. And so in detriment for the people who's doing the handcraft. So it's very interesting because you see that intellectual property has a lot of derivatives and problems if it's not fixed in the right, proper, and just way, as you mentioned with Creative Commons. That's a very tricky thing. No, it's like, I'm giving you the license, yeah, sure, yeah, but how would you get that knowledge before? No, and that's the question we should be addressing. And I think Dr. Janette mention how we can transcend this idea of the public and the private domains and work towards something more just. Yes, please, Dr. Janette. Your speaker. Yeah, we don't listen to you, Dr. Janette. Janette.
I know. I'm. Look, it's just too complicated. I had to switch off my hand and then I forgot to switch on my mic. Come on, old dogs and new tricks. Anyway, I really just wanted to say, of course, to be realistic, we're talking about a treaty framework here, which means we're talking about states parties, which means that the only mention of Indigenous heritage is in the preamble to the convention. Despite a lot of efforts to have Indigenous heritage specifically recognized in the body text, it was negotiated out. I think it's really an important point to make because we have to just be aware of this fact that it's the old story. I mean, it doesn't need any explanation as to why this is the case. We all know why. But I think that shows us that efforts like your own and also what we try to do within the NGO Forum, which is, sometimes to build up some pressure from below and even to some degree educate our states parties when we can. Because it's not impossible, but it's just a case of we have to think in those terms and say, right, we know it's an imperfect framework we're in, but it also offers us opportunities. And, the more that we can get these issues on the table, we can start shifting the mindset over time. That's what we can hope to do. And I think that's exactly what your work is doing anyway, shifting the mindset. And that's great. And just very, very quickly, Robert, I see you want to say something. I think also coming back to the idea of ownership and possession, what I really liked was the idea that it's also shifting the idea of what possession is. And it's sort of saying, look, possession is about this kind of cultural, if I can say, reappropriation somehow. And that it's not about ownership in the sort of very narrow legal sense, but it's about ownership in some other sense, which is much more about moral rights than economic ones. Anyway, I shall stop now. And Robert.
Yes.
Just to agree very much with what you were saying, Janet, because the convention speaks about community participation. I think what we're speaking about is consent. And as cultural property is driven by the community that possesses it. And there's something, I really don't like the word inventory, frankly, for a few reasons. And, I think that deeper documentation is better. And there's something about inventorying which can sound extractive. And I think what we're speaking about here is work that's not extractive, anything but extractive, that's done with the consent of the people who possess the heritage and in collaboration with them if it's an outsider. I mean, a reflection that I'm having in this discussion is so much of the work with labeling has been done with archive materials. And I guess it's a question for our speakers is given that these archive materials were collected extractively in a sort of colonial kind of manner very often, how would behavior change now in working with communities to inventory, if you will, a document in a way that's respectful, that involves mutuality and ownership by the community? So that's a question, but a change in behavior.
So just the what we've seen with institutions is I think it sort of pushes in that way, and we actually, you know, through the use of notices, you know, through the use of notices and setting them up so that institutions and researchers can disclose that interest, that automatically changes changes expectations around things. Now, I don't think you know, because it's not legal, it's not means that these things aren't enforceable, but when it's really transparent that you should have spoken to someone, you can then start to kind of apply moral pressure, or, you know, other ways, ethical commercialization, you know, things like this, where you can say, you know, you're using this here, but everyone can see that they said that that wasn't appropriate. And so I think bringing some transparency into those spaces ends up being a good thing. It is, I think it is, you know, it's taken a long time for the collections to be put together, and they're kind of fixed within these sort of frameworks and logic. So we're trying to break some of those open a little bit, and then just really see what emerges. And the hope is that actually the institutions and communities themselves, as they engage, will start to shape what a better way of working looks like, you know, kind of relevant. And I think some of those things start to become general practices, and some of them will just become, you know, specific relationships. And one thing to talk about those, we sort of alongside this, it's prompted a discussion about whether we can create a recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous peoples data. And so just thinking about that sort of standard side and a kind of technical space. And so there's a working group with the IEEE Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineering, I think, that is working on a sort of a provenance standard at the moment.
So do we have any more comments, questions? Yeah, please, Jorge.
I'm sorry, I'm listening the YouTube, so I missed the cue. Jorge, please.
Thank you, Gustavo. I was just thinking about these interconnections that we are mentioning with the digital world and new technologies in particular, because I think that after COVID, the digital space has become like a prime venue for traditional and non-traditional people to share their cultural expressions. And I think that is why I appreciate so much the work that Diana is doing with her organization, because she has put a special attention to the possibilities that new technologies can foster to either overcome legal obstacles or to propose paralegal strategies. We already briefly discussed these possibilities of these digital labels, as with the TK local context labels. But I know that in some other sectors, for example, in the field of visual arts, there are artists that are already engaging with the blockchain and tokenizing on the blockchain their digital assets. I'm talking not only for pieces of culture that are being digitized, but on the other hand, I'm talking about pieces of culture that were born digital, right? And so I just wanted to highlight how some of these high-tech or edgy developments can potentially coincide with some indigenous premises. I know that visual artists are using the blockchain to have this fractional ownership of a particular piece, in the sense that there could be entire communities that take ownership of a particular image. And when I heard of that, I figure that resonates a lot with collective ownership of traditional knowledge. So I'm wondering if there's still a lot of interconnections to be drawn between the use of these resources and the way that collectively held knowledge can be circulated more ethically.
Yeah, so I think that's...
I'm sorry, Professor, please.
Oh, no, just we're definitely thinking about that. I think, you know, the label helps with the provenance part, the sort of the connection part, and it can inform, you know, what appropriate access looks like. once you get to the sort of a benefit share again, like we have a open to commercialization label or a not for commercialization label, reflecting, you know, things that people have said, but you then need the models around what that looks like. And so, you know, we're really conscious that there needs to be what will be the next steps that follow, and how do we support communities to engage in those sorts of, you know, those sorts of arrangements. And yeah, look, it'd be great to, you know, talk some more or think some more about what that looks like in a cultural heritage space. We're involved in conversations. There's the COP around the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, and the introduction of digital sequence information into the benefit sharing arrangements, which is going to push that sort of data element, you know, strongly into focus around what benefit sharing looks like. So we're working with some other colleagues to start giving some thought to that part of it. But, you know, I think there's, you know, alignment. I think the tools will end up being the same regardless of the space, or potentially the same.
Thank you very much, Professor Maui. I have to wrap it up because it's the time. However, I would like to have, as I mentioned, I will propose a working group and invite people from around the world to join, and maybe we can have this conversation from time to time during the next year, and so we can discuss more about how integrating on different contexts and what's going on with different initiatives regarding your wonderful, wonderful job. And kudos to both of you, Dr. Janette and Professor Maui. Thank you very much for accepting in so short notice our invitation.
Can I just make one sort of potential suggestion? Look, if I think, yeah, just a comment about it not being sort of not being a part of the treaty at the moment. I think there is value in doing something in practice and showing that it could work for it to be able to be shifted in. And maybe it is some sort of discussion that we have about how that gets promoted. We've had conversations with WIPO. There's a lot of interest there. And it may be about making the labels available in other languages so that it can be taken up in different places. There is some French, some Spanish. We'll probably talk with Mexico about where that looks a little bit more sort of following the SAMI discussion, just had a general conversation about what that might look like. But I think the more inclusive it can be, the easier it becomes to shift into some of these other spaces.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was saying about the educative value of what you do. It's really important. And the other thing I think is worth mentioning, that actually sometimes government departments do actually listen to the institutions that you're working with, and they can leverage some influence over the governmental bodies. So we can just hope.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that's everything. Thank you for the viewers in YouTube. I know the important thing is this is recorded so more people can see it, and we'll leave the links for consulting with and the email so they can get in touch with our speakers. Thank you very much, Dr. Janette, again, Professor Maui, and everybody who's been here. I know Mati is like what, 2 a.m. in the morning, something like that, almost. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Bye. So could we meet in the room? Yeah, I know it's late. I know, Janette.
I'm gonna get a cup of tea. I get a cup of tea, then I join you. Okay?
I know, but it's just the last.
No, I mean, seriously.
It's the last one.
Seriously, if I have a cup of tea, I will join you. All right? Okay. I won't be long.
See you there. See you all there. Thank you. Bye.
I don't hear you. Your microphone is muted, Lori. Gustavo wants to be. You're muted.
Okay, he wants us, Gustavo wants us to meet. Is there anything special that has come up? No?
I don't know.
Don't know?
I don't know. Okay, in another room.
Okay.